today with Dinglis and Max here, talking about four color Blink in Modern, a deck that I've had a reasonable amount of paper tournament success with, and is one of the best decks in Modern.
Yeah, so today we'll be going over some of the different deck choices, not deck choices, card choices in the deck, how it plays out in different matchups, what cards you should be looking for, like what kind of hands you should be looking for with this deck. Yeah, just go over the archetype in general. Um, so David, this is the list that we have in front of us. Is the list that you have been playing to some success the last couple of weeks, right?
Yeah, but been very happy with it. It's got some new Kamigawa cards. It's got some quite unusual card choices. But I think Blink is one of those decks you can really tune to your like whatever you think the meta game will be.
Yeah, and also to your
Um,
liking, right? Like there's it's
yeah,
not it's not sure yet what build is the best. Like we'll go over some of the particulars in a minute, but like a Ladomri Skull or Ragavan are like some of the choices that people have been like switching between. Personally, you're a big fan of the Eladamri Skull version of the deck, playing different creatures like Eternal Witness, Endurance, Magnus of the Moon, but also, of course, Omnath Fury and Solitude, which are very solid to get from Eladamri Skull. Why do you like the Eladamri Skull version so much, and what do you think um, is the big upside of playing this over something like Ragavan?
so I'll start by saying what I like about Eldar is cool.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously you're an 80 card deck, so there are some consistency issues. So Cool can help you find your best card, which is probably on Neff, and start getting the train going. Like the deck has its core game plan is just to run everyone out of cards and getting your Omnath more consistently is pretty appealing. Also, in some matchups, you'll just Eladamri's Call for Eternal Witness, pick up the Eladamri's Call, and against a deck like blue white, that's actually quite difficult for them to beat because none of their removal interacts very well with our Eternal Witness.
Mm-hmm.
Like paying 3 mana to kill an Eternal Witness that's just got back a Eladamri's Call is laughable. Solitude in it is amazing for you, and also like you you need to find your like cards consistently.
Mm-hmm.
It also lets you play some really powerful one-offs. The Amulet Titan deck, game one, I believe, is completely dead to Magus of the Moon. And a lot of decks really struggle to beat an Endurance. So having just like a couple of bullets, you don't need to have like 6 different creatures. Like you don't want like low impact cards like I don't know Reclamation Sage. So Darkness Court just gives you some silver bullets and some consistency, which is quite a rare effect for a card to have. It's a
Okay.
bit like it's like the kind of thing you see from like Earthen Pod. I think it's like definitely good in the deck. Um, I couldn't really see cutting it currently because I think a big appeal of Eldar is cool in a format like Modern is, especially if you play paper, people don't have like the best decks all the time. So having like these powerful like bullets to just cold like someone's amulet deck or
So could it be that maybe because you are playing a lot of paper these days, right? Could it be
yeah,
that Eladamri's Call is better in paper because you see less pickup of like the very popular decks that you see on Magic Online and only tier one decks, and in paper it's of course a way more diversified meta. Do you think that has an impact on how good Eladamri's Call is?
not necessarily. Not necessarily. I really think Aladama's Call is just a good card. Um, the card people cut that in the witness package for is Ragavan,
Mm-hmm.
and the problem I have with Ragavan, it's obviously a phenomenally powerful card, but it doesn't do very much in a lot of matchups against Hammer Time, which is probably the most popular deck on Modo at this point. It gets blanked by Memnite, any of their creatures. Um, everyone, a lot of the decks have good removal to beat it. So I think that Ragavan is a good card, like in the sideboard,
Okay.
but I don't really like it game one because I think the format is built to beat decks like the two most popular decks are probably Hammer Time and Grixis Death Shadow, which have small, bulkful creatures. And for me, like Ragavan doesn't really pull its weight. I don't really like Memory Deluge either. I think it's not really goes well with what the strategy of the deck is trying to do. You're trying to play to the board at all points, and Deluge is like this very reactive card. It's very powerful in a deck like blue white, but for me, I haven't been very impressed when I've tried out Deluge.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think like one of the reasons why like Canister and Yellowhead, Gabriel and Thief have been playing Ragavan is because it's like this very powerful one drop that is like an early threat slash win con slash mana development on its own, and I think it makes some amount of sense that what you're saying is like Ragavan is a card that's very easy to answer, right? Like a lot of decks are already prepared for it because it's being played in like the strongest two decks in the strongest decks in the format. Um, but I don't know, like I think it might be fine because especially with this deck, it's very solid to play it out on turn one. Like if it dies, you don't care too much because you still have a lot of other stuff going around. But if it sticks and like you get to attack with it and have a couple of triggers, the mana development is of course huge for a deck like this, right?
There is appeal in them. Like I don't dispute it's a really good card, but for me, like I just find that it doesn't really mesh with what the game's trying to do. And like you said, like it's a personal thing. Like I prefer like seeing my Omnus more consistently rather than trying to ramp them out.
Mm-hmm.
I really like your sideboard cards get a lot better when you play a Dharma's Call, or your sideboard creatures.
One of the problems I noticed with playing Eladamri's Call is that especially if you draw like both of them, which of course doesn't happen too often, but even sometimes if you draw just one, it can be a bit clunky, especially when you're on the draw and you have to consistently answer stuff. It can be difficult to get like this open spot where you can actually cast it without it hurting some other part of your game plan.
Yeah, like the card can be, but then I find like sometimes if you just like choose a Fear of Fury, um, that undoes a lot of like the slowness of the call. I'd be interested in maybe exploring a version with Ragavan main and Eladamri's Call. I really don't like Deluge in the deck very much. I think it's not really what the deck wants to do.
So what you're saying is maybe play something like this, but then cut the deluges and add Eladamri's Call instead.
Yeah, maybe. That sounds quite good actually. Like thinking about it.
Yeah, so it keeps the potential of Ragavan, which like I think we can both agree that in some matchups Ragavan on turn one just completely can run away with the game, right? Especially in mirrors, it can also be very strong if you're on the play. I think.
Oh yeah, like the card's like phenomenally powerful. Like it's the best red card in forever.
Yeah, and I think one of the upsides about it as well is that you don't need to play it on turn 1 for the card to be good. Like in a lot of matchups, it's also good on turn 8, for example. You can dash it into like maybe an attack an opponent's Teferi. You can use it to just like 2 mana, get a treasure, and look at the top card of your opponent's library, may cast it this turn, which is just a very powerful effect. Because you can do it consistently. So I think there's definitely some upside in playing Ragavan because it can completely run away with the game earlier, but it's not like that later in the game as well. And maybe like if you're already playing Ragavans and Eladamri's Calls, you don't really need the memory delusions because unless you're playing some very very grindy matchup, you're gonna be up on cards in the end anyway, right? With 4 expressive, 4 mana and 6, Omnats, the fairies. Like I don't think card advantage is a big problem.
You very rarely, unless against like Death Shadow, you very rarely run out of cards with this deck.
Yeah, and for example, against Death Shadow, Memory Deluge is like it's good when you top deck it, but the problem is that it's very difficult to hang on to a card like this and to find a moment for it to shine when you're playing against a deck that is aggressively attacking you. Like tapping out on turn 4 against Death Shadow is not really something that is easy to do.
No, I agree. I'm playing like a big local tournament this weekend, and I haven't locked in my list. I could be convinced to try Ragavan main. Because the problem with playing sideboard is it does eat up a lot of those slots.
Okay.
I just have to quickly answer my point now. I'll be 2 seconds.
Sure. So one of like that's basically the big choices in the main deck. While either choosing to play more one drops, making the deck I would say like a bit maybe a bit better in the early game, because if Ragavan is attacking, it can block, like it can jump, but it can also attack and make your game plan easier, get more mana, make it smoother. Or the other option is playing Eladamri Skull, which makes the decks really much more of a reactive deck, which it already is, but this makes it more of it because you can use Eladamri Skull to get like a Soul Tooth, which just makes it a 2 mana, get like a Swords to Plowshares, play the Swords to Plowshares, and of course that is always a 2-for-1, like your opponent, it gets rid of, you get rid of one creature, use 2 cards, but because the deck has so many ways, like Expressive Iteration, Ran and 6, to get those cards back, at some point you'll definitely like get back on cards, and it's not bad to 2-for-1 yourself in the early turns. A good thing to note is the pickup of these lands that have come from the new Neon Kamigawa set. They are basically used to generate extra value with Ren and 6, and are very solid for like finishing out, for example, the Sogensen for finishing out the game with Ren and 6, or Boseo to like start killing your opponent's lands or artifacts. With Ren and 6 you can do it over and over again, which is a very solid addition to the deck. David, the next thing I wanted to talk about is you choose a Lightning Bolt, a 4-off, as your main 1-drop removal. And we've seen other people diverge into maybe playing some amount of Unholy Heats, or Yellowhead almost playing only Unholy Heats. What is your thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting. It's funny actually. When I first looked at Blink, it was all Lightning Bolts, but now the trend has kind of switched to see more Unholy Heats. I don't have any huge thoughts on it yet. I could probably try a split. I guess Unholy Heat's very appealing when you're fighting against Primeval Titan.
Yeah, and getting Delirium is not super difficult to this deck, right? Because like in modern, creatures like die, planeswalkers die, like you cast sorceries, you cast instants, you have lands. It cannot be too difficult to get Delirium in this deck, and I think it's very likely by turn like 5 or 6 you'll have it, which maybe to a lot of people sounds late in the game, but with Grixis Death Shadow, for example, like you're always gonna play a lot of turns, and the difference between 6 damage and 3 damage can be very relevant. One of the downsides, of course, is you can't use like the bolt with Ren and 6 to like bolt later in the game when that might be relevant.
I think like a split is probably reasonable.
Yeah.
The deck sees a lot of cards, so I'd probably favour like a 2-2 split.
Yeah.
I have noticed actually, this is more true of Eternal Witness, that sometimes you can just bolt Eternal Witness back bolt and then Ren and 6 someone out of the game.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that I don't think it's a huge thing. If you expect Titan, I would play more Unholy Heat.
There's also like not a lot of creatures where the difference between 2 and 3 really matters, right? Like I cannot really Yeah, it's just Channeler, yeah. But like Channeler is a creature that in the early turns doesn't have Delirium, so it dies to Unholy Heat, and later in the game you'll probably have Delirium, so it doesn't really... I don't think there's a lot of spots where that's gonna make a huge difference.
I think like a 2-2 split is where I would like move forward.
So another card that I have some lists have like picked up 1 or maybe 2 copies of is March of Otherworldly Light. What are your thoughts on this one?
So I hate spreading seas in this deck now. So you need more ways to deal with Urza Saga. Currently I play 0 spreading seas. I played 2 March of the Otherworldly Light at the weekend, and it was pretty good. This deck just wants like cheap cards. Like if you make it past turn 6 or 7 and you're not playing versus like Tron or Amulet, you're just gonna overpower everyone. So I think that March is kind of a perfect card for this deck.
Oh, I accidentally removed it, but I agree. I think the card is very solid. A good thing to note is it can kill Ursa Saga for 1 mana, right? Which is one of the huge upsides on the card. But also, if you have like a lot of mana or like some white cards in your hand, it's just a hard removal spell with no downside on your side. Which like it's very strong, right? Like Prismatic Ending is probably better, but this card is very solid as well.
Yeah, it's like Prismatic Ending 5 and 6, and this
Yeah.
kind of deck appreciates the effect.
Yeah. So I was actually quite interesting to see like when we look at sideboard cards. Of course, you have the Sanctifiers and the Magus, which makes sense because you're playing the Aladamri Skull pack. But you put Ragavan in the sideboard for your latest events. Can you explain why you decided to not play them main, but I did want them in the sideboard?
So Ragavan is really powerful, like, as we talked about, like for all the reasons. Like it against like Living End or Blue White or Rhinos or any of these decks, just like this cheap creature that helps get you the mana advantage is key. I even bought it in against Burn. So it has value in a lot of matchups. And I wanted to try the card. I just wasn't really happy with it in the main deck because of like, especially in paper, like people often play decks that are like more creature focused, like more like Jund Saga and Hammer and those kind of decks. So it's not really that good in that kind of meta game. But the card is powerful, and in some matchups it's incredible. In the quarterfinals this weekend, I made a Ragavan game too, and my opponent knew that I didn't have the main, was like horrified because they're playing blue white, and they're like, I have to have the answer to this or I'll just die. So the card has value. I think it's like.
Does it not give up too many slots in a sideboard?
One of the reasons is like it's fine because you get slots back by playing Aladamri's Call because you play some like good card, like some tools in the main like Magus. It does take up a lot of slots. Like there are definitely other cards I wouldn't hate having in my sideboard. I wouldn't mind like another copy of Force of Vigor, for example.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm pretty happy with where I am with Blank. The things I'm thinking about are, so I guess something we haven't talked about yet, is Oath of Nissa.
Yeah, it was a one-off in the main.
Yeah, I've been trying like 1 to 2 copies.
I know that Paigonti was a big fan of Oath of Nissa, and I think he even had like 2 or 3 copies of it in some lists in the past. Again, like I'm not sure on it. I think it has some overlap with like Eladamri's Skull, that it makes your deck smoother, but it can be a bit clunky. Although 1 mana and 2 mana is definitely a world of difference. So
yeah, the reason I like Oath of Nissa currently is because I've kind of gone off Spreading quite a lot. As anyone who's read anything I've read for the Patreon will know, I love Spreading Seas. Like in blue white, I always want to play 4. But the problem with Blink is like, yeah, it's a 1-for-1 with Urza Saga, but I think March does that job pretty well. You'll never beat in Tron in a million years with this deck, even with Spreading Seas. Like your 2 copies of Spreading Seas aren't going to save you in that matchup. And like you can't like chain them together to like mana screw burn or that kind of deck because you played 20 more cards. So the reason you want to play Oath of Nissa is because you need more targets for your Urian to blink in the late game. So that's why Oath appeals to me. Also, it's pretty good. Like, I mean, someone did the maths for me this morning, and like you're on 97% hit with it in your turn 1 configuration, which is great.
Like
bonus never hits.
Yeah, I think like worrying about like I have not had it hit not hit. I think, but it's possible if you had like 3 sorceries. Like you also have another one-off in your one-drop slot. It's one ephemerate. Also a card that like people started off with like 4 or 3 copies and moved out to mostly 0. Um, so why have you chosen one? And do you think it has the potential to maybe go up in number again, or are you considering cutting it completely maybe?
So it's kind of like when you put Eternal Witness in your deck, the combo of Eternal Witness and Ephemerate is really difficult for anyone to beat. Because it requires like multiple removal spells, and you can just grind them out. So it's kind of like locking up the game. Especially in paper, the clock can be a really big factor. So having like a way to say to your opponent, I'm just going to bleed my Eternal Witness every turn, and then net the best card in my graveyard every turn, usually get some concessions if you're ahead. Also, the card obviously has great value with um, Solitude, Fury, but those combos are powerful. My problem with the card, however, is it's quite bad in fair matchups. Like against Grixis Death Shadow, it's a bit of a blank because they have so much removal, and it can be hard to set up these board states where it's good. But I like the first copy a lot. I think it's a really when I build my constructed decks, like the one-offs have to be like. I mean, Oath of Nyssa is a really bad example of this, but it's really secretly like a fifth abundant growth. Same with March of the Otherworldly Light. The one-offs have to be like really high impact cards.
Yeah.
Because they're not part of your core plan, but they can be good in the late game.
Especially in like an 80 card deck, a one-off is not like even if you get to half of your deck, it's only like a 50% shot to see it, right? So like
yeah, Ephemerate isn't the plan.
Yeah, yeah. One of the cards I wanted to discuss sideboard-wise is Relic of Progenitus, which is a card that hasn't seen like it has always been a factor in Modern, but it was more of like okay, so if you have like if you're playing like humans or something and you want a way to interact with the graveyard, you choose Relic because it's colorless and easy to cast. But nowadays we have seen a lot of the 4 color decks which actually have like um, access to the best graveyard hate in the format, playing Relic of Progenitus, which is pretty interesting to me. Why do you think that Relic is currently good in Modern? And why does this deck choose to play Relic over something like the second and third Endurance, for example?
So it's very important in this kind of deck to have cheap cards. Like the reason this deck is good is it gets to leverage all the cheap cards in Modern, like Bolt, Prismatic Ending, Iteration. Like it's just about being like a cheap threat. Endurance can be a bit clunky, and if you ever have to like 2-for-1 yourself in the early game to evoke it, it can be a bit of a disaster. And Relic also like it makes you cards back, which is important, especially against a deck like Grixis Death Shadow.
Yeah, I also think one of the upsides of Relic is right that you can use it over a multiple of turns, which is actually very solid against like Grixis, where the Delirium can also be an important factor, and it's really solid. Like because for example against Croxa, you don't need to crack it unless they're getting close to the amount of cards to escape it, but you can just keep using it every turn, and they need to put more cards in the yard every turn than you can get rid of, which makes it interesting because they need to overcommit for you to even crack it, right? Which is very strong with this card.
Yeah. Also, like the nice thing is like again because they're like obviously a fourth season position deck, you can like in the way to like delay you getting the card back is really good. So like when you've done trade 1-for-1, you've got this like way to draw another card that they can't like discard from your hand, which is quite important.
Mm-hmm.
I think knowing when to pop your relic against a deck like Grixis Death Shadow is really important. I'm just a big fan. Like, I mean, I've been playing Modern since the format started in 2011, and like nothing that happens at a Modern tournament will surprise me anymore. Like, I've lost to Zombie Treasure Hunt, all sorts. So like when I pick cards, and we'll talk about my love of explosives, I'm sure. You want these really generic, like overlapping cards because you just don't know what someone's going to do to you in Modern. Like I'm sure you've probably played like tournaments where you've been like, I don't know, scape shifted or like you just Modern's so no matter how powerful the format is, there's always someone playing their deck, and that's
Yeah.
part of the format.
For sure, like I have faced more in the rares in the modern format. Like everything can happen. So, um, like I think it's a very solid answer. It's actually quite funny because it's one of the like older and most like probably most seen like removal graveyard hate cards in the past of modern, and it's showing up again, which is cool. Even though sort of very solid cards like endurance have been printed. It's good to see the oldies still have a spot in these 4-color piles.
It's not just all 2021 cards.
Yeah. So what I wanted to go over now is maybe like what are the matchups you want to face and what are the matchups you definitely don't want to face with this deck.
Sure.
Let's go to the round 1 of your local modern tournament. Which is the deck you want to play against the most?
Blue-white control. Any control strategy. You just run like Ren and 6 is a huge problem. It's funny, like when I started playing the deck, I compared Ren and 6 to Bitter Blossom because the games where you have turn 2 Ren and 6 are just ridiculous. They're so easy compared to the games where you don't. This deck just crushes any control deck. Like you have like a better companion than you got expressive iteration. Your deck's for 2-for-1s. Like it's just a nightmare for any control deck. So any form of control deck is a pretty good time, in my opinion.
Yeah. Also, like the fairy. Yeah, like there's almost no card in this deck that is bad against control. Maybe like Solitude, but even that is like a 3/2 flash fire, which is fine, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like you've got like you're a bit behind in like utility lands, but with Beseiju and the Red Crucible, like you actually have like really good you've got so many tools. Like
Beseiju is also a good answer to your opponent's utility lands, right?
Yeah, for sure. Also, March of the Otherworldly Light kills Horn of Storm Giants for 4 mana, which came up a couple of times at the weekend.
Yeah.
Because it can. So yeah. Any control deck, like that's the kind of what you're looking to play against.
Yeah. Okay. So what would you say is the worst matchup for this deck?
Pictures of Goblin Guide and Burn spells. You don't want to ever play Burn with this deck. I think it's a terrible matchup. I think people who are just like, make an Omnath, not really living in reality because Omnath doesn't even do anything till turn 5 and then gets burned. You have no ramp. So I don't really think like Burn is good. Tron is pretty bad. Belcher is pretty bad, although I've never lost to it online. But I've been pretty lucky against Belcher. Like, yeah, those are like the really bad matchups.
Basically, you're willing to face any mid-range / fair deck. Aggro decks are fine as well, unless they're burn. Even some combo decks are fine, depending on like what they do, right?
Yeah, for sure. Because you've got like endurance for like oops, and when you know you can like formulate your game plan.
Yeah.
I think this deck is really good in tournaments where you can scout and know what people are playing. Like I knew in my paper tournament, my round 3 opponent was playing Titan, so I just mulliganed for a hand that can make Magus. Like you can't go too deep on mulliganing, but you can like definitely mulligan like Bolt Prismatic Ending on their 3 lands if you know what they're playing.
Yeah.
I think like out of the most popular decks, like on Modo, like Hammer is pretty close, but I think you're ahead. Like I think the way you lose to Hammer are the games where they like just turn to you and you just don't have the answer. But I think in a long game you'll beat Hammer, especially now with Beseiju and Ren and 6.
What I have noticed is when playing Hammer against 4-color is that when you're trying to be the good player and play around Solitude too much, you're gonna actually end up losing more. I think that when you're just like new to Hammer, you just jam, you're probably gonna win more versus 4 color than when you're a bit more cautious and wait more, I think. Because the longer the game goes, yeah, like the higher the chance becomes that they draw Solitude or get more mana. Like that's and what I really like about it with like Solitude is you can tap out. You don't need to give anything away about what's in your hand. But if your opponent doesn't play around it, then you have it to win the game. And if they don't play around it, then sure, maybe they'll grab a game. But most people will play around it because they're afraid of it, and then you'll win. Which is very strong.
I think you have to go aggressively, like against this deck. Like you can't win any kind of on-game versus it. Like I know Hammer does have the tools to grind, but those tools are more to grind out like Shadow and Blue Red, not the like Solitude decks. I don't think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think Hammer's like I do think you're favoured as Hammer. Favoured as Blink versus Hammer. I think Death Shadow is pretty close, although I must admit that is a matchup where the version I have with Call and Witness does feel a lot better. Because just like getting to Eternal Witness back a land can be really good versus Shadow, whereas Ragavan can be a bit of a liability.
Yeah.
It's so hard to set up. I think Blue-Red Murktide is... I mean, a lot of matchups I think are quite close for Blink.
Yeah, in that sense, this deck is like kind of the new Junt, right? Where it can win versus almost everything, but it can also lose versus almost everything.
Yeah, it's funny actually. I was talking to someone about Rhinos, and I realised that actually, like, probably the Rhinos deck is the new Jund deck in Modern. Like, it just plays the best interaction, which is Force of Negation and pitch cards, and then has like Crashing Footfalls being some Tarmogoyfs.
Yeah.
But this deck does have like quite a similar matchup spread to Jund.
Yeah.
I think it's like the deck has like a lot more power though.
Yeah, like, of course. But also I think in that sense you have to evaluate the power of the entire Modern format, and when like Boomer Jund was good like a year or 5, 6 ago, the Modern format was way less powerful than it is today.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it's interesting because like a lot of people ask me as a like Boomer, do you like Modern more now? And I went, yeah, I think like powerful cards are exciting, but like all the power is in different decks, which is kind of cool. Like, I personally would like I'll rant a bit about Companion. It's probably like it's a mistake.
Yeah.
But you can't really ban Lurrus without banning all the other companions.
Yeah, I think that's like the problem is that Yorion is like close to being too good, but it's probably fine, and Lurrus is almost definitely too good for Modern, but for some reason we have been just ignoring it. Like, I think Lurrus is played in like the top, like from like the best decks, the tier 1 decks, it's played in like 50% of those, right? It's pretty insane. And
yeah,
I think companions as a whole are definitely one of the like problems maybe in Modern long term, is that almost all the decks have a companion, but there's only like 3 relevant companions, maybe 4, but I would say 3, and that makes deck building maybe, although there's a lot of difference in decks at the moment, you still have like these cards that are like your commander, and you have to play like you have to work around them somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, we shouldn't spend too long on this probably, because I'm sure it could be a whole podcast.
But yeah, for sure.
I think that like Blink is like it's a really really good Magic deck. Like it's powerful. It has nut draws. Like, a big problem, like, I mean, I used to play a lot of blue-white, is like, you need nut draws to win Magic tournaments. Like, it's just, they're so hard.
Yeah.
Especially on Magic Online.
And like, blue-white control doesn't have them, right? Like, there's no God hand with blue-white control.
Yeah, like counterspell to fairy memory deluge, but even that you've still got to like work to win the game.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like it's yeah, like I think Blink has like all of like the tools and like I would say like to anyone listening like there's as long as you play like the core good cards of Omnath, Teferi, Ren, Expressive Iteration, you can kind of do whatever you want and like you shouldn't feel that like I worried a lot that like oh am I being a bit of a hipster because I don't agree with what Canister and Gabra and Seath players. Those players are incredible. Um, but I realised in my meta game, like that Ragavan just isn't a good game one card. Um, but you have to like, and you have to realise that like, I think something a lot of Magic players get wrong is not considering the meta game of their tournament.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to go play if you're going to go play a local 30-player event and you know everyone, like suppose you really like playing Rhinos, but you know that the four good players in the event are going to play blue-white control. You probably just can't play Rhinos because it's just an awful matchup. So like, I guess like the advice about Blink is like, think about what's in your meta game and don't worry too much about what Canister's doing for the mocks or what. Like, obviously take people's ideas because there's like other versions of Blink. Like one of the best players on Magic Online, Jabberwocky, has a completely different build with free to fairy hero of Dominaria.
Yeah.
Which is so different to what anyone else has thought of. Discover N, who is like a vintage end boss, thinks like 2 time warps is acceptable, and lots of people think that's also ludicrous. So yeah, like don't. I guess like try the cards, like see what works for you, and don't be too afraid.
Yeah, I think also that's where Eladamri Skull is gonna shine. Like the Eladamri Skull is very good when you know what your opponents are gonna play, and you have cards like Magus of the Moon that can shut those decks down. And I think that's where it's gonna be very solid. If you have like these haymakers that you know that that is gonna be good against the opponents, yeah, that is very very solid.
I think a lot of people make mistakes with Eladamri's Call before, and definitely I did, by playing like cards that are too low impact in your sideboard. Like, because everyone's got like the dream of like I'll get my Night of Autumn. I mean, I really like Night of Autumn, but you need to like make sure your cards are high impact. Like your bullets need to destroy your opponent, not like
Yeah.
get +1 card.
Yeah, exactly. Like Night of Autumn is like solid, but in the end, it's often just a 3 mana destroy your enchantment, and I get a 2/1 that chumps for 1 turn, right? Like the card is very solid, but it's not a aim. It's not a bomb or something.
It's not like Magus of the Moon. Like
Yeah.
In the tournament I made like in the semi-finals on Saturday, I made game on Magus of the Moon. My opponent was like, I'm dead. I can't beat that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think Blink is. I don't know if it's the best deck. It's quite hard to say on Magic Online because it is prohibitively expensive.
Yeah. Not only on Magic Online, it's also very expensive in paper. Yeah. So, like, it's very understandable if you don't have the resources to get this deck on paper because it's very expensive. And yeah, like we are both like long time players and we have a big collection which makes it more easier to like pick up the last pieces you need for a deck like this. But especially when you're like a starting player, this deck is very difficult to get your hands on.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, I'm very lucky. Like, some people let me run 6s, and but I think the deck is like, I think Modern really has like 5 quite good decks in Shadow, Hammer Time, Blink, Blue Red, and Amulet Titan. And yeah. I think those decks are all quite healthy to have as be good decks. It's not like, oh, the best deck is Dredge, or the best deck is Eggs, or Storm, or like, I think that the format's quite good right now.
Yeah, I also like there's a lot of meta shifts where, like, sometimes, for example, Hammer can be very popular, which puts Blue-Red Murktide a bit lower, because that matchup is just very, very good for Hammer. But if Hammer is very good, I think for Color has more of a spot to rise, and then maybe Blue Red Murktide can get back into the meta game. There's like a lot of triangles where if one deck is good, another deck becomes good, and then in the end it will just like switch around, which makes it very fun because you can have your deck, and as long as you're very good with it, you'll basically almost always have a chance. I think also a lot comes down to player skill in Modern, so especially with a deck like 4-color. Um, there's a lot of decisions, and you can definitely make an impact on the game, and it's not just who drew better, right? There's really a difference there.
Yeah, like planning your mana out is key. Like knowing what to fetch is really important. It's kind of like Zoo actually from many years ago. Like it's a bit easy because we've got all 10 fetches, but knowing what your mana base is, what you can draw. But yeah, I agree. Like I like the shift in Modern. Like I think that Modern's a lot about creatures, which is good. That's the kind of format people like playing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I think Blink is like it does have that like I understand why people dislike the deck because it's like it's all the fire design cards in one deck, and that's kind of true, but it's not even clear it's the best deck. It's just one of a format of very powerful Magic decks.
Yeah, I think this is like one. Modern might be the only format where a deck like this is viable because you have the time to set up your mana base with like triomes, but also the fetches, and you don't need to win on turn 2-3. You have like enough good lands and mana fixing for you to have those colors consistently and fast enough, and then like you just get like just enough time to actually get your mana, set it up, and then play out your strong cards. But you still have to be aware of the fact that sometimes like your mana base might just be too painful or too clunky, and that will definitely lose you games. And fetching properly will be very important with this deck, probably more than any other deck in Modern. So be aware of that. Like use your triomes. Yeah, you just use your triomes really well. Also be aware that sometimes it might be better to take 2 damage of a shock land rather than fetching a basic, just because you'll need the mana in like 2 or 3 turns. You really need to plan ahead with this mana base, right?
Yeah, especially with Sanctifier and deck in the sideboard. Especially like if you play more copies, you really want to make that on turn 2 where you can. So think about getting like Rawgreen Triome, Sacred Foundry, Temple Garden, Hollow Fountain.
Yeah.
Just think about what your deck can like do. I'm trying to think if there's any other things to talk about.
I think we have almost got all the topics covered on the deck. I think it was very instructive, very nice. Yeah, I think we definitely got most of the topics. We talked about the important card, the decisions, Eladamri's Golf versus Ragavan. We talked about some of the one-offs, how the deck plays out, like why the cards are good, why it's not that bad to 2-for-1 yourself in the early game, about the different choices with the deck. I think we got most of the parts covered. So I would like to thank you for your time and input on the deck, because you have definitely had a lot of success with it, and you also know a lot about the deck.
It was really fun to talk about it.
Yeah. So to all the listeners, this was a one-time episode, but maybe we'll do something like this again in the future on a different Modern deck, or maybe on 4-color Blink again in a couple of months when the deck is completely changed again. So see you then.